Imagine two cities right next to each other. They share, the same geography, same culture, even families living across a simple border.
Okay.
Yet one is, well, prosperous, full of opportunities, while the other struggles with poverty, corruption. We're talking about Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora.
Right, the contrast is incredibly stark there.
It really is, and it makes you wonder, what's the real reason some nations or even whole continents that maybe seemed similar way back, like North and South America or Korea centuries ago, why have they ended up so vastly different in terms of wealth?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's what we're diving deep into today. We're looking at research that goes beyond the usual suspects for explaining global inequality.
So not just blaming it on, say, climate or resources.
Exactly. Forget those easy answers tied to location or some inherent cultural thing. Our mission here is to really pull out the core arguments from this research, to understand what really drives national economic success or failure, and hopefully give you, our listener, a clearer picture of this complex economic landscape.
And the material you've brought for this deep dive, it really makes you think. It digs into these fundamental forces shaping wealth and poverty, stuff that challenges a lot of common assumptions. So where do we start? What's the absolute core idea we need to get?
The central argument is this: a nation's long-term prosperity, or lack thereof, it really hinges on its institutions.
Institutions.
Yeah, both political and economic. It's less about the physical place or diseases or even deep-seated cultural habits, and much more about, well, the rules of the game.
The rules of the game.
The laws, the organizations, the whole framework that shapes how people behave, what they're incentivized to do in a society.
Okay, institutions. It still sounds a little maybe abstract. Can you make it more concrete? Like back to Nogales.
Sure, Nogales is the perfect starting point. As you said, they share so much. But the critical difference, it's the institutions on either side of that fence. In Nogales, Arizona, the institutions generally support the rule of law, corruption is relatively lower, and people have better access to public services, schools, healthcare. There's a system, imperfect, sure, but it offers more opportunity. People can start businesses, feel reasonably secure about their property, participate politically. It's those different rules that lead to such different results, even with shared roots.
Got it. And across the border in Nogales, Sonora.
Well, it's often a different story. You tend to see a weaker rule of law, more corruption, maybe less effective public services, and just more hurdles to getting ahead economically. Starting a business might be tangled in red tape. The risks from crime or instability are higher. The institutions there just create a very different set of incentives, often holding back widespread prosperity rather than encouraging it.
So this isn't just something that happened recently. These institutional differences, they must go way back historically.
Oh, absolutely. To really get it, you have to look at how North and South America diverged way back during colonization. When the Spanish arrived in places like the Inca Empire, their main goal was, let's be honest, extraction. Gold, silver.
Right.
So they set up these incredibly harsh systems of forced labor. You have the encomienda.
Which was like granting settlers rights to native labor.
Exactly. Rights to demand labor and tribute. And then the mita, this brutal system of forced mining labor, especially in places like the Potosi silver mines. Think about Viceroy Toledo. His regime really systematized this forced labor, and the impact was just devastating and lasted for centuries.
Wow, a really stark picture. So how did it play out differently with the English up in North America?
Well, the English experience, say, in Jamestown was pretty different. They didn't just walk in and find huge stockpiles of gold or silver, nor a massive population they could easily enslave for large-scale projects.
Okay, so no quick riches.
Right. So the colonists themselves actually had to, work to survive. And this meant the Virginia Company needed different kinds of people, skilled workers, farmers, not just conquistadors. And over time, this led to the development in the 13 colonies of more representative assemblies. Political rights were broader, still very limited, mind you. Not for everyone, but broader than under the sort of autocratic Spanish rule further south.
It's fascinating how those initial conditions, those first institutional setups, seem to have cast such a long shadow forward.
It really is. And this focus on institutions, it directly challenges some of those older, maybe simpler explanations for global inequality.
Like the idea that it's all down to geography. Climate, resources, location.
Yeah, the geography hypothesis. It sounds plausible, right? A country's location, its resources, maybe its disease environment that dictates its fate.
Seems logical.
But the evidence doesn't really back it up strongly. Take the reversal of fortune in the Americas after 1492.
What's that?
Well, regions that were relatively rich before the Europeans arrived, like where the Aztec and Inca empires were, they actually became poorer over the long run compared to places like North America, which were less developed initially. The geography didn't flip. The institutions imposed on them changed everything.
That definitely pokes a hole in the pure geography argument.
It does. And think about the Middle East. Historically, a cradle of innovation, now facing different challenges. Geography alone doesn't explain these shifts.
Okay, what about the other big one people talk about culture? That some cultures are just, more inclined towards hard work or innovation.
The culture hypothesis is another one that seems intuitive, but struggles under scrutiny. Look at Argentina, Uruguay.
Okay.
They have a higher percentage of people with European ancestry than Canada or the U.S., but their economic track record isn't as strong.
Interesting point.
And conversely, think about the incredible success of places like Japan or Singapore. Very different cultural backgrounds, not traditionally European, yet huge economic achievements.
Right.
Even within, say, Latin America, cultural variations don't map neatly onto wealth levels. And a really powerful example is China after Mao.
Yeah.
That massive economic takeoff wasn't because Chinese culture suddenly changed overnight. It was because Deng Xiaoping initiated major changes to their economic institutions, allowing markets and private incentives to play a much bigger role.
Okay, so if it's not primarily geography and it's not primarily culture, it really does seem to circle back to these institutions. But you said institutions, are they all the same? Or are there different kinds?
That's the crucial next step. No, they're definitely not all the same. The key distinction the research makes is between extractive and inclusive institutions.
Extractive versus inclusive. Okay, what's the difference?
Extractive institutions are basically designed, whether intentionally or not, to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a small elite, a narrow segment of society.
Okay, so benefiting just a few at the top.
Exactly. Think of it like a rigged game. Under these systems, property rights are often insecure, the rule of law is biased, and opportunities for most people are severely limited.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about the historical Kingdom of Congo. The rulers could impose arbitrary taxes. They could basically confiscate property whenever they felt like. It's expropriation.
Right.
So why would anyone invest or work harder or try to innovate if the fruits of their labor could just be taken away? There's no incentive.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for stagnation, designed to keep most people down. So what about the other kind? Inclusive institutions.
Inclusive institutions are the opposite. They're characterized by things like secure private property rights for a broad section of society, an unbiased legal system that enforces contracts fairly, and mechanisms that allow lots of people to participate in both economic and political life.
So more level playing field.
Exactly. It's like a game where the rules are fair, everyone has a chance to play, and things like hard work, talent, and innovation are actually rewarded.
And how do they foster prosperity?
Well, they encourage investment because people trust their property is safe. They foster innovation because inventors and entrepreneurs can benefit from their ideas. Think about the impact of patent laws in places like the U.S., encouraging invention. They allow talent to rise from anywhere, not just the elite.
It makes intuitive sense. If people feel secure and see opportunity, they're more likely to invest, innovate, work hard, all that good stuff.
Precisely.
But can you ever get economic growth under those extractive systems? You mentioned stagnation, but does it always happen?
That's a really important nuance. Yes, you can get periods of economic growth under extractive institutions. It's not impossible.
How?
A powerful elite can sometimes allocate resources towards specific industries, often heavy industry, by basically forcing it to happen. The classic example is the Soviet Union under Stalin.
Right, rapid industrialization.
Huge growth rates for a while, yeah. They shifted mass amounts of labor from agriculture to factories, often through coercion. And this is the key part. The growth is typically unsustainable.
Why unsustainable?
Because it lacks genuine innovation and dynamism. Growth under extractive systems often comes from mobilizing existing resources or copying technology from elsewhere, not from groundbreaking new ideas. There's no real incentive for that kind of creative destruction.
Creative destruction? That sounds dramatic.
It's a term from the economist Joseph Schumpeter. It means the constant process in healthy economies where new technologies, new companies, new ways of doing things replace the old ones. Think cars replacing horse-drawn carriages, or computers replacing typewriters.
Okay, constant churn and innovation.
Right. Extractive systems usually resist this because it threatens the established elites who benefit from the old ways. Also, that growth often relies on forcing people to work, not empowering them, which eventually hits limits. The Soviet system ultimately stagnated and collapsed, partly for these reasons.
So these different types of institutions, inclusive versus extractive,
Yeah.
how do countries end up with one or the other in the first place? Is it just luck?
It's often shaped by history, particularly by what the research calls critical junctures.
Critical junction.
Yeah, these are major events or periods that shake things up, disrupt the existing political and economic balance, and open up possibilities for change, potentially sending societies down very different paths.
Like what kind of events?
A huge one in European history was the Black Death, the plague in the 14th century.
Okay, how is that a critical juncture?
Well, it dramatically reduced the population, creating massive labor shortages.
Mm.
But how societies responded differed. In Western Europe, particularly England, where peasants had already gained some leverage, it further weakened the lords and the old feudal system, eventually leading to more freedom and better wages for labor.
Oh.
But in Eastern Europe, where lords were stronger, they responded by doubling down, imposing even harsher conditions on the remaining peasants, a second serfdom. Same shock, different pre-existing power balances, totally different outcomes.
Wow. So a single event can push regions in opposite directions depending on where they started from.
Exactly. Another huge critical juncture was the era of Atlantic trade and colonization we touched on earlier. And in England, specifically, the Glorious Revolution of 1688.
What happened there?
Essentially, Parliament asserted its power over the king. This led to big changes, more secure property rights, limits on the monarchy's ability to arbitrarily tax or interfere in the economy, a stronger legal framework. It really shifted England towards more inclusive political and economic institutions.
Setting the stage for later growth.
Very much so. Contrast that with, say, Spain at the time. Still absolutist rule, property rights were insecure. The crown defaulted on its debts multiple times, ruining banking families who'd lent them money. Not exactly encouraging investment.
No, definitely not.
Or look at the Ottoman Empire, which actively resisted innovations like the printing press for centuries, fearing its disruptive potential. There's this anecdote about King James I in England reacting badly to William Lee inventing a knitting machine back in 1589.
Why? You think that'd be good?
He apparently worried about the weavers losing their jobs. It shows how elites in more extractive systems often fear that creative destruction because it disrupts the existing social order and their own power base.
That fear of disruption seems like a major obstacle. So once a country gets onto one path, either inclusive or extractive, does it tend to stay there?
That's another key finding. These paths tend to be self-reinforcing. Inclusive institutions often create a virtuous circle.
Virtuous circle.
Yeah. Inclusive political institutions support inclusive economic institutions, which generate broad prosperity. This prosperity then creates demands for even more inclusivity, maybe wider voting rights, better regulation, which further strengthens the inclusive nature of the system. Think about the expansion of suffrage or antitrust laws in the U.S. over time.
Okay, success breeds more success, reinforces the good system.
Pretty much. But unfortunately, the opposite is also true. Extractive institutions tend to create a vicious circle. Extractive economic institutions enrich a narrow elite. This elite then uses its wealth and power to solidify its control over the political system, ensuring the extractive institutions remain in place, which keeps generating wealth for them and limiting opportunities for everyone else. Poverty and elite control become self-perpetuating.
Can you give an example of that vicious circle?
Well, think about the U.S. South after the Civil War. Slavery, the ultimate extractive institution, was abolished. But the Southern elite managed to regain political control and impose Jim Crow laws.
Right, segregation and disenfranchisement.
Exactly. These were new forms of political and economic extraction, designed to control labor and maintain the old power structure, just in a different guise. It severely limited opportunities for African Americans for generations.
So even a massive disruption like the Civil War didn't fully break the cycle there.
Not immediately, no. And you see similar dynamics in many post-colonial countries, say in Africa. Nations like Sierra Leone inherited extractive institutions set up by colonial powers. And often, new elites simply took over the existing system rather than transforming it. It's sometimes called the iron law of oligarchy. New bosses become like the old bosses.
That's quite pessimistic.
It can be. Even seemingly technical things, like how Argentina's political factions historically fought over packing the Supreme Court, can be seen through this lens. It's about manipulating the rules of the political game to maintain control and protect an extractive economic system.
Are there any examples of countries breaking out of that vicious circle?
Yes, thankfully it's not impossible, just difficult. Botswana is often cited as a positive example. After independence, its leaders made conscious choices to build relatively inclusive institutions, manage resource wealth responsibly, and protect property rights, leading to decades of growth. It shows that paths can diverge, but it often requires specific historical circumstances and, frankly, enlightened leadership at critical moments.
Okay, so it's not deterministic, but the tendency is strong for these systems to persist. And you mentioned creative destruction being key for growth. How does that fit into the virtuous and vicious circles?
It's absolutely central. Sustained long-term economic growth, the kind that really lifts nations out of poverty, almost always requires that process of creative destruction. New technologies, new industries, constantly replacing old ones.
Huh?
Inclusive institutions tend to allow or even encourage this, even though it can be disruptive in the short term because the overall benefits are widely shared and there are mechanisms to adapt. But extractive institutions run by elites who benefit from the current setup, they actively resist creative destruction.
Because it threatens their power and wealth.
Exactly. Why allow a new technology that might undermine your monopoly or make your assets obsolete? So they block innovation, protect incumbents, and stifle the very dynamism needed for long-run prosperity.
This framework, it really provides a powerful lens for looking at the world. So bringing it all together, if you had to state the absolute core message for understanding global wealth and poverty based on this research.
It really comes back again and again to the fundamental importance of inclusive political and economic institutions. It's about setting up a society where opportunities are broad, property is secure, contracts are enforced fairly, and power isn't concentrated in the hands of a tiny few. That's the bedrock of long-term shared prosperity.
And for you, listening to this, someone interested in understanding these big global patterns, how can you apply this?
Well, it gives you a powerful analytical tool, doesn't it?
Mm.
You can look at different countries, different historical periods, and ask, are the institutions primarily inclusive or extractive? Who holds power? Are there real opportunities for people? How secure is property?
Right, it helps you look past just the surface symptoms.
Exactly. It helps explain why sometimes foreign aid doesn't achieve much, or why just holding an election doesn't magically fix everything. If the underlying institutions remain extractive, those surface changes might not lead to fundamental shifts. You need to address the deep structures.
It really emphasized the complexity of development. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's a final thought you want to leave us chewing on, something to really make us think further?
Maybe this. We've talked about how sticky these systems are, how virtuous and vicious circles tend to reinforce themselves. So the real puzzle, the really hard question is, how can nations currently stuck in that vicious cycle of extractive institutions and poverty actually break free? What does it take to genuinely shift towards more inclusive systems, especially when you've got powerful elites who benefit enormously from keeping things exactly as they are? That's the challenge.